Well, hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Adam's Music Box, where today I want to talk to you about one of my very favorite composers of all time. Any era, any national or regional tradition, anything at all. He's simply one of the very best. And you can see half of his face behind me now. And this is, of course, Alexander Scriabin, the Russian composer who came to prominence in the final 2 decades of the 19th century before dying at the age of 43 in 1915. So, what was it that made Scriabin special? Well, many things, but most of all was his musical futurism. Well, he never used the word futurism to describe his music as some people born later, ironically, than Scriabin would. There was something about his music that, in terms of its style, in terms of its approach to harmony and tonality, and even in terms of the philosophical underpinnings of the music, there was something that looked above and looked out. And this isn't just about the sort of psychological and intellectual and spiritual pedigree of Scriabin, which was put into the music. Listening to the music, you can tell this. There's something about the music that sounds totally ethereal, totally otherworldly. It doesn't sound like music that you could even pin to a certain point in time. When you listen to Bach, for example, you know the time in which he was writing. When you listen to Mozart, the same could be said. The same for, let's say, late romantics like Dvorak. In particular, you could say that a lot of the modern and postmodern composers who went way into atonality, and some would say way overboard into atonality, you can tell, this wasn't written in 1850 or 1750. It was written sometime between 1950 and 1980. You can just sort of tell. With Scriabin, no such "you are here" in terms of when it was written is offered to you, because the music really stands alone. There's no one that really sounds like Scriabin, but nor did he go consciously out of his way to make music that sounded nothing like anyone else. And the result is music that's very pleasant to listen to. It's not easy listening by any means, but nor is it difficult. It's again something that's new. It can be challenging at times, it can be riveting at times, but it's never harsh, it's never ugly. It's always very insightful, enlightening, and quite a lot of the time, if not most of the time, it is exceptionally beautiful. Now, all of these descriptions might not do justice what we're really getting at. So let's look at the kinds of compositions that Scriabin concentrated on. You can really divide these into two categories. One, there were his solo works for pianos, for example, his sonati, and also what I would say that probably his most endearing piano legacy are the 24 preludes. Although he died before having recorded any of his piano playing on what would have been the primitive recording equipment of his day, we do have quite a lot of what we can call recordings based on the piano rolls that were made by Scriabin. Now, what the hell's a piano roll? Well, the player piano was obviously a much more elaborate version of a record. And before we got into the age of high fidelity, the only way you could hear high fidelity music performed at home or in a bar, at a hotel lobby, without having a living musician play it for you would be a player piano. Now, the piano rolls were essentially the direction that the instrument was given, the prompt, if you will. So human musicians would sit down at a piano, and it would essentially print out in what looked sort of like Braille writing on a scroll what they were playing in terms of their tempi, in terms of their choices of intonation, and obviously it isn't as exact by any means as having a human play before you or having a high fidelity recording, but it's surprisingly close to how it was originally performed. And Scriabin, as a composer and performer, made quite a few of these piano rolls, including some of his beautiful preludes. And I'm going to put a link to some of those modern recordings from the original rolls on the description of this video. Um, Safranitsky was also a very, very well-known performer of Scriabin. Niehaus was another one. I might put some of their links in as well. And then, of course, there are his orchestral pieces, all of which, except for one piano concerto, are called symphonies, but they really have no resemblance at all to the traditional symphonic form. Many of them are just a single movement. Many have more than four movements, but many are played without break. So, although they're called symphonies, they're more like extended tone poems, if you will. His first symphony, as he called it, for instance, ends with a beautiful orchestra and chorus section with several vocal soloists. Then he wrote his second symphony, which is generally his most traditional. Then he went into further concepts of dissonance and really expansive modern ideas of harmony with his third symphony, also known as the Divine Poem. And then his fourth and fifth symphony are called, number four is called the Poem of Ecstasy, one single movement. And number five, his sort of magnum opus in the minds of many, is the Poem of Fire, sometimes known as the Prometheus or Promethean Symphony, hence the fire. All of which are extraordinarily modern, but without being comically so, the way that a lot of music, both in the early 20th century and, of course, into the mid 20th century, sadly became. Again, there's a timeless quality, both in a literal sense and in a metaphorical sense, to all of his compositions, because you can't really pin them in terms of place and time. Now, as I was saying earlier, Scriabin had many esoteric views on spirituality. He had sort of syncretic views of mysticism, traditional religions, science, and other things like that. Very heterodox beliefs, but again, this may well have informed his futuristic leanings. And he was also an early pioneer in combining visual performance with musical performance. He developed an instrument, but not a musical instrument, known as the light organ, sometimes referred to as the color organ. And it was intended to be used in conjunction with the musical performance of his fifth symphony, his Promethean Symphony. Now, this instrument looked sort of similar to an organ. It had keys like an organ or a piano would, but when you press them, it was designed to shine bright lights into the back of the hall where the music was being performed. And it was told to the player of this contraption when to play certain keys that would correspond to certain colors, because Scriabin had the theory that certain tones and tone combinations psychologically and metaphysically related to the colors in the atmosphere that one would see. Very few performances of this symphony were ever performed with a functional light or color organ. There were about two in the history of this that were done, most of which happening after Scriabin's lifetime. And now it's considered something of a novelty to actually perform this piece of music with this instrument. Now, in his lifetime, Scriabin's music was very popular in his native Russia. In fact, at his funeral, he died at the age of 43. So, in his prime, you could say Rachmaninoff performed Scriabin's music. And this was the only time on record that an adult Rachmaninoff played music at the piano other than his own compositions. Obviously, as a child, he would have, but not as a professional musician as an adult. Outside of Russia, his music was sometimes ignored, sometimes chastised, because it was so unique and because it was so different and because of various bigotries against Russian composers and Russian people in certain quarters. He never got the acclaim that he really deserved outside of his native Russia. Although in the second half of the 20th century, as more and more people started discovering the Soviet recordings of his orchestral pieces by people like the great Golovanov and Sviatlanov, and again, I'll put their recordings of Scriabin into the description below, more and more people became aware of just how great he was. He's still not mentioned as vocally as others in his same generation, and I, for one, think that should change. So do yourself a favor, listen to some Scriabin today, and you will not regret it. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.